Avatar: The Last Airbender, Imbalance, Issue 1. It starts with Aang and his friends riding Appa, and after Sokka lampshades how this is boring with nothing going on, eventually Toph asks them to stop at her dad's factory on their way to somewhere else. Eventually they land Appa, and I hope it's explained why everyone's apathetic to the Avatar, despite the airbending he showed off. Toph's dad thanks her for bringing Aang here for him and says he's always glad to see his daughter. Yeah, now. He eventually explains that because this is a brand new town that was only recently just a street with a few shops, it had no local government, so he was able to form a government with himself in it. How's he supposed to juggle running a factory and this? I can't wait for stuff to happen instead of just people talking, because I'm really bored right now. The art looking a tiny bit off already started me out uninvested and bored. Aang gets thanked, and Sokka gets told by a shopkeeper that he's selling a helmet from a chieftain he can't even name, and Sokka would have a hard time seeing out of the helmet, which destroys her peripheral vision, but somehow he still decides to buy it, and Aang's impressed by it. Why is Sokka being an idiot? The good thing about Sokka is that he's smart. This is the wrong kind of comedy for him, missing the point of his character. The shopkeeper keeps them from buying from him because some people plan on fighting with each other for obvious reasons. So Aang tries to mediate, and this drags on a bit for no reason, when it's not an interesting story. You get it after the first panel. And really, nothing interesting happens here considering we've seen earthbending before. Toph thinks she can only get them to stop fighting by committing assault. I'm glad the series sacrifices realism and that the main characters don't get arrested constantly and have to deal with restricted rights and bad reputations because they get into fights. But that goes without saying, and that's true for the show too. That's how boring this is. It gets exciting when Sokka's put in danger and Toph wants to save them. She hits someone away with impact shown and grabs a building that's gonna start collapsing. Katara's already frozen someone who is in the fight, and Aang gets Toph away from the building with his glider when obviously she wanted to keep it from collapsing. He says there wasn't anything left to hold up. She'd know that better than anyone because of her seismic sense, so why'd she question him doing this instead? Aang apologizes for leaving Katara in the middle of a fight as they hold hands, and Toph admits she cares about Sokka. The benders who started the fight took off while Katara was getting people out of that collapsing building. First she said the building was empty, and now she says this. Were there two collapsing buildings? Why was this kind of dialogue made? Toph's father thinks he needs Aang's authority to stop the fighting between the two types of benders. Even though he should know that this kind of thing can't be talked away, and the violence would come back as soon as he leaves. And he can't stay here forever. He should be old enough by now to know he's wasting Aang's time. Out of nowhere, people refuse to let Toph create buildings with earthbending because they hate benders that much that they're fine with being homeless for 1 billion years while they go through the tedium of fixing their house the hard way. These are literally the stupidest people in the franchise. While petty people do exist, how could all of these people be outright self-destructively petty, making themselves put up with weeks of suffering? I know I forgot everything about this arc now. People hating benders and the problems with that are not story ideas that result in a visual, so it's not memorable. At least not the way it's done in this arc. At least in Korra, when this was already done, it had a bad guy who robs people of bending because he hated bending. I knew this would be about hateful citizens and firebenders and earthbenders feuding, but this part was forgettable. Katara says while holding Aang's hand that she'll go with Toph to the factory. I love that there's ostrich horses. I don't know if that's from the show too, it's been years. I just love the idea because their constant laying of eggs would make them profitable to their owners. It's explained that there aren't enough jobs in this town, which caused benders to turn to crime, which is supposed to explain people hating benders even though non-benders can mug people too using knives just as effectively. Benders are just the only people who'd be able to protect themselves from muggers. Aang and Sokka go to the government's meeting, and somehow, despite everything they've been through in this issue, Aang wonders why benders and non-benders are segregating themselves here. More importantly, how did Sokka come to the conclusion that everyone on one side was a bender and everyone on the other side wasn't one? You can't tell who has magic from just looking at them. Normally part of the appeal of Avatar is that it's a much nicer world than Harry Potter's extremely depressing one, partly because people with magic are open about it, and the ones without don't hate them for it. It's just seen as normal. This is realistic, but that's only appealing a little bit for just one panel, and that one panel is enough for me to get it and want the very basic plot to end. Toph's father says he wants to ban bending on public streets. It should be obvious that this won't work because it's already illegal to mug, and that didn't stop the muggers, so this is only going to stop bending that isn't evil, making it always look bad when it is seen to make things even worse. Which I know he doesn't want, or he wouldn't have asked Aang for help. Meanwhile, Toph visits Toru, and there's a whole lot of boring talking. Satoru long-windedly explains that it's his fault there's not enough jobs in town because when he upgraded his machine, which he foreshadowed in an earlier issue, he didn't need as many benders anymore. Somehow all of his other bender employees quit all at the same time because of this, when they need their jobs, especially in a town with a job shortage. I have to assume they were all overconfident that they'd be able to get new jobs really quickly for this to be believable. But without that being explained, this looks forced. And it is because the more people are involved, the less likely it is that all of them acted like this. He says the same kind of machine was put in other factories causing the same problem, and now some benders refuse to work for factories not owned by fellow benders, as if that would cause them to be guaranteed not to use these machines that would make them more money. Toph praises machines and is thanked. Eventually Aang makes a speech where he ends up saying that the ban is stupid and what the city needs is a police force. Why is he assuming it doesn't have one? That's impossible. It's not like the town's just a day old. Of course there's been crime with no police. It's a civilization, how would there not be police? Someone agrees with him, and why does she say her name? That's implying that she's supposed to be an important character for the arc. I wonder if she'll turn out to be a villain out of nowhere, and the way she smiles with half-closed eyes is giving that away. So Lilling plans to use a team of benders for the new police, who were protecting her factories earlier. Toph's father wants there to be non-bender police too, and Lilling only wants to start training them after he deals with the bending violence problem. Even though obviously it'd be impossible to eliminate it completely, and there's no reason she can't have non-benders getting trained at the same time that the benders are going on patrols. Somehow Aang doesn't notice this, and even the skeptical one beside him doesn't say this. She's gotta be a villain, with her non-stop smug smiling. She thanks Aang, and everyone votes in favor of the idea, completely trusting her for no reason, despite her making it obvious that she has no interest in a non-bender police force, which at first makes perfect sense because they're going to be completely inferior to the other one. But Toph's dad pointed out that having one would make the non-benders feel better, so her wanting to postpone this anyways is a dead giveaway that she doesn't care about them. Even Sokka doesn't pick up on this somehow. But it would be even more stressful if the main characters did and spent the whole arc worried while being powerless to stop her. And this is at least in character for an idealist like Aang. Sure, it's convenient for Lilling that even the non-benders voted in favor of her idea, instead of refusing because she's a bender. Sokka plans to send a messenger hawk to Suki to tell her to come here. It's revealed that Toph's father always knows how to treat guests right, all of a sudden, so that's sweet. Katara agrees to ride Appa with Aang just for Appa to land, and eventually Aang does predictable whining that's predictable because he already completely gave away what his whole problem with this was. There's such a thing as being subtle. I know both sides of the story on this one, but I really don't want to read this giant snore fest. She reassures him successfully. Eventually someone's smart by complaining about someone stealing from the poor instead of just the rich. Even if it is just for a pragmatic reason, it's still a good thing. Is she really naive or just lazy? Because you should know they'd be mean cops. They could go literally anywhere else to hire benders. Bafflingly, she's repeatedly told to get lost. At least explains that it's because they like being criminals. So while it's shockingly stupid of them to turn down a job on a silver platter, it's still realistic. A bunch of earthbending is done against them. This would have been fun to see, but it's only fun for one panel before it stops actually showing the impact. The fighting causes the mob boss to agree to the job offer. I know we're supposed to think these girls are evil for this, but the main characters constantly use force for the greater good throughout the show. Even Avatar Kyoshi did. So when Toph is just as violent as her, it'd be hypocritical of the writer to think that violence is only okay for the good guys, while using it as shorthand to create suspense with anyone else. It's already tacky enough that Liling's always drawn smirking. It's completely unnecessary and needlessly annoying, and it breaks the immersion because most people don't smirk all the time because they know it makes people not trust them. The next morning, Aang gets his friends up early so they could have the whole day to clean up garbage on a small part of the beach. It's relatable that Aang wanted to do something valuable even if it's just this. Someone asks Aang if he's the Avatar, so he must have been wondering if he was an air acolyte instead at first. Thankfully, these kids do respect bending. It's even more sweet because they like him despite being firebenders. How is one of them unaware that Aang knew Zuko? How did he not get told they saved the world together when he did know that? Sokka makes it not so great that they're firebenders by wondering if they'd still like Aang if they were non-benders. It would have given the story the levity it desperately needed if they were non-benders, which is what I assumed at first. Because I always assume that a character is a non-bender until they prove otherwise. But instead this was almost pointless. Almost, because it was still light-hearted. The story didn't have to have them be benders. I have to assume Sokka's just being satirical when he says he only hangs out with Aang to impress strangers because he likes that he's a nice person. Eventually Toph wakes up to a noise and finds out a machine's jammed and conveniently thinks to save herself from an explosion fast enough when explosions are really fast and she didn't know what happened. And she's not a machine expert. Eventually she tells Aang she can feel people running away nearby who might have sabotaged the machine. This leads to a typical fight with them, although there's barely any actual fighting anyways. The scene mostly consists of Aang acting nice to one of the criminals. He somehow doesn't already know why he sabotaged the machine when it's so easy to figure out he wanted to destroy it for stealing people's jobs in a desperate place. The cliff crumbles when he's trapped in Earth, thanks to Liling's daughter. One of Liling's daughters doesn't approve of the unnecessary cruelty, which makes me wonder if this is some blatant foreshadowing completely giving away that she's gonna turn on her. Because someone evil wouldn't say this. Not that I'm complaining, because I can't get enough of heel-face turns. It's always better than writers stubbornly refusing to ever write them because they like having every villain be a bland monster for no reason. But it wasn't necessary to have foreshadowing to what might be the only real plot twist in the arc that just makes it look too obvious in the first issue. Because when the plot twist is gonna happen, it's probably gonna make perfect sense even without that. Of course, Aang rescues them. It turns out the nice one's called Rue. She looks too much like her mother, who at least tells them she doesn't want them fighting with each other. That's sweet. Along with her not blaming them for their failure at all, when that's what I'd expected. She's still creepy after this though, talking in an unusually emotionless way. It's better for her to be calm than hot-headed with her children, but her dialogue comes off as so stilted here. She says she needs them to be united in this goal, giving even more foreshadowing to the potential obvious plot twist that they won't be. The story ends with nothing happening but her thinking the Avatar can't stop her plan because she's desperate to think that. This issue by Faith Aaron Hicks is about Aang and his friends visiting a town where non-benders and benders hate each other depressingly because there's a lot of bender criminals now. And this is blamed on an upgraded machine stealing jobs from them, which gets sabotaged by someone because of that. So the villain's got a great motivation, but the story was really boring because it's really just talking, and the only things that happen are the generic stuff for any Avatar story that don't make an impression on my memory. As in, bending happens, but the specifics don't matter. The machine getting sabotaged was probably new for Avatar, but otherwise anything that happens isn't mandatory to describe the plot, and probably happened a million times in the show considering all the bending in that. I don't want to watch the entire show again to find out what's new about the comics. I'd rather the comics be as interesting for me as possible because I can't remember every single thing that's already been done. It's no wonder I forgot about everything that happened in this arc since I last read it. There's nothing visually distinct here, or distinct in general.